Fame as a goal seems to me spectacularly puzzling. It might be that people think of fame as a proxy for things. If they were famous, but also sad and unpopular and poor, that wouldn't be so good. But if they're famous, the chance that they're going to be popular and have friends and have the money they need and be happy is higher, and that's okay. But the idea of fame as such, I don't get that.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter Hyde. My guest today is Cass Sunstein. Cass is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He's one of only 25 professors at Harvard who carries the University Professor distinction. He's also the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. In 2018, Cass received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and the Humanities. And in 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its technical advisory group on behavioral insights and sciences for health. From 2009 to 2012, Cass was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. He would subsequently serve on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technologies and on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board. Cass has authored hundreds of articles and dozens of books. The books include Nudge, Improving Decisions with Health, Wealth, and Happiness, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment, and Sludge, What Stops Us from Getting Things Done and What to Do About It. His latest book, which I have an advanced copy of here, is How to Become Famous, Lost Einsteins, Forgotten Superstars, and How the Beatles Came to Be. Cass, welcome to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's a great pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Well, Cass, as I mentioned in the introduction, you've had quite a varied career in academia, as a public intellectual through the written and spoken word, as a public servant. I wonder, how do you describe to a person you've met for the first time who doesn't know you, how do you describe what you do?
I'm sometimes a bureaucrat, I'm sometimes a scribbler, and I'm sometimes a guy who gets to spend time with amazing students in a classroom. That's I guess what I'd say.
And how do you order those in priority from most enjoyable to least?
Well, I follow a little bit Aristotle here in the sense that they're enjoyable in different ways. So rank order is challenging. Probably if I'm writing something I'm excited about, that's what I like very most. If I get to work in government on something that helps people, that's probably the most gratifying. And to see a student doing something extremely creative and novel, that's completely thrilling.
Well, with regard to the writing, as I noted in the introduction, you are prolific, to be sure. And I wonder, how do you identify topics worthy of pursuing in book form? And I think this is, at least for me, a particularly interesting question because the topics you've chosen to cover so many different swim lanes. If one were to see your sort of academic credentials, the sorts of things that you have taught at Harvard Law School, for example, one might assume something very different from the output of where you have focused, which is to say, not necessarily focusing. So how have you gone about your development of intellectual interests, and how do you determine when something is worthy of putting into book form?
Thank you for that. It's a fantastic question. Sometimes I feel a kind of tingle in my spine almost. It's a physical thing, which is a feeling of anticipation and excitement about a topic. And if I feel that, I think I'll probably want to spend somewhere between 6 months and 10 years on the topic that is producing that tingle. Sometimes I think I have an idea, which is at least it seems to me at the time, to have some maybe minimal, modest claim to originality. And then I'll think, well, if that is something that can be an engine behind a book, then I get really delighted and excited. Sometimes I think if I have something that's just a great topic, which a book can be organized around, like conformity or extremism, I'll think, let's give that a shot. Though I've had many failures through that route where I had a really good topic, but I didn't have a book on it. And then it's just stuff on my laptop.
Yeah, interesting. And I also wanted to ask you how you choose your collaborators. You've had some great ones. Richard Thaler or Daniel Kahneman come to mind as two examples, two academics with whom you were very close. Obviously, Daniel Kahneman recently passed, so who you were really close with. I wonder how do you choose collaborators? Your latest book is you do not have one, at least not one that who is acknowledged on the front cover, but many of your books and your writing will include others. How do you determine when to go solo versus those opportunities you pursue in concert with someone else?
It might be that the ideas are developed with someone else. So Dick Thaler, my co-author on Nudge, we've worked together on behavioral economics and behaviorally informed policies for a long, long time. We did a few articles together, and some of them attracted much more interest than we expected. And then we thought, well, if people are interested, maybe there's a book there. We also like talking to each other and working together. So if Thaler wants to do a project with me, it can be about, AI, or it can be about the Boston Celtics. I'll say yes. I just love working with him. Danny Kahneman actually called me up twice, really, to ask me to collaborate with him on projects, one of which was a multi-year research project, the other of which culminated in our book Noise. And since Kahneman is one of my heroes, I think he had, I wish I could say has, one of the most fertile minds of the last 100 years, the chance to work with him. That's like a dream. So of course I'd say yes to that. I did a book recently with Tali Sharad, who's a neuroscientist with whom I've done a bunch of articles. She's a joy to work with. I think she's the best writer I've ever worked with. Sorry, all others. Thaler is a phenomenal writer. I think Tali Sharad is even better. She just has a vivid way of constructing a narrative. And she also is extremely imaginative and easy and fun to work with. So when she asked me to work with her on this book, that was really easy to say yes to. So if there's someone who's great to work with, that's number one. And if they are amazing in terms of their creativity, then that's like the best thing you can get.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have to tell you that you get some strange looks and questions when you're reading a book called How to Become Famous in a Public Space, like a flight, for example, as I've been doing in recent weeks. Ironically, what would appear to be a how-to guide isn't that at all. To some degree, it seems like your title is the book equivalent of clickbait. I don't know. Is that fair? I don't know if you've got that reaction from anyone else.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. One is this book actually is a guaranteed must-have guide to how to become famous, and famous or your money back. I think I can guarantee anyone who reads it fame, like extraordinary worldwide fame, within a week at the outside. Some people are reporting that they expect and are on the road to getting famous actually within as few as 3 days. So, of course, everything I just said is completely ridiculous. Didn't think of it as clickbait. I thought of it as a joke. So I thought of it as exuberant and comical. So that was the goal of the title. That when I started working on the project, and I can tell you about what got me started on it, it wasn't a book, but I was keenly interested in fame and success. And then when it turned into a book, I thought that was definitely the title. It's a little bit of a knife in the let's say, the flank of a number of people who've written books that are actually about that and purport to show you a guide. So, of course, the theme of the book is that the very project of writing about that is not going to succeed.
So you're not going to, in fact, offer any money back, I guess.
I mean, if you don't get famous within a week, don't get your money back. So confident am I that this has the recipe to fame. Triple your money back.
Wow, nothing can go wrong there, Cass, I don't think. To what extent has some degree of fame been a goal of yours, I wonder? Because you actually have achieved some. You're not on a Taylor Swift level, but you have achieved some. And I wonder how does your level of fame appeal to you? And to what extent was, having a broad reputation, something akin to fame, has that been appealing to you over time?
Well, thank you for mentioning Taylor Swift, who features in the book and almost got a chapter of her own. I can explain why she didn't, if you like. But I was in a rock group called Synergy. I'm sure you've heard of them. Well, we didn't have a record, but we didn't get famous. We didn't really make it. We weren't any good. I've never pursued fame, so it's never been a thing for me. I guess what I've thought is if I can write a good academic article or say something about law or something that's not useless, that's great. As a young professor, I wanted to get tenure. As a young lawyer trying to be a professor, I wanted to get hired. Once I got tenure, I did hope I could work for government at some point, but not because I would get known. Instead, that in government, you can do so much in a short time to help people in a week in government. If you're lucky, you can improve the lives of a large number of people, maybe help make the number of accidents on the roads lower, maybe help the air get cleaner, maybe do something to increase public safety. And all that's fantastic. And if no one knows you participated in that, that's actually even better.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You write about the extent to which you have accrued some fame is at least partially due to a very lucky turn that you have both written and spoken about, which is a friend of yours crossed your path, I believe it was while walking to school, and said he was applying to private school, something you didn't even understand what that meant. And it led to a conversation with your parents. I believe you said your father was against that because it wasn't something that the family could afford. Your mother, however, became an advocate for it, and thus your own application happened and was successful. And you have noted in multiple venues the importance of humility and understanding that one's accomplishments, though of course hard work and taking as many swings at the plate, so to say, are very important. That we also need to be humble enough to recognize that there are these lucky turns that are also critical in helping people along towards a pathway towards success. Talk a little bit about that story, if you wouldn't mind.
Personally, I was, an okay student in sixth grade, and I liked school and I liked sports, and I was starting to like girls, and life was fine. I was at a good public school, so I don't think I would have ended up unemployed or anything, but I wasn't on a path to be a law professor and get to write books and such. I did run into my best friend named Roger. I just happened to run into him. I didn't most days. I remember it. I was 11. I remember it very clearly. And I asked him how he was. And he said, "Good, I'm applying to private school. I'm applying to a school named Rivers." I didn't understand any word he said, except I knew I was competitive. I was competitive with my friend Roger. And if he was applying to private school, then maybe I should too. And I came home and said it. I kind of asked, "What's a private school and should I go?" And my mother thought it was the best thing ever, really. I think she thought that was a place that would nurture her son and help her son. I wasn't struggling, but really give more individual attention, et cetera, than you would get in public school. My dad didn't say anything. I learned after that he was not in favor of it because it's expensive. And while we weren't poor, I think his belief was he couldn't afford it, or if he could afford it, it would be really hard for him. And I learned maybe 20 years later that my first 2 years, my mother paid for my private school out of her inheritance from her dad. And that may sound less dramatic than it is. My mother was a penny pincher. She grew up in the Depression. She was always afraid of economic hardship. She was not poor herself, but she knew things could collapse in a hurry. And the idea of spending what was a relative fortune for her son to go to private school, that wasn't in her nature. I'm quite sure she never did anything like that before or since. And if I hadn't gone to that amazing school, it's called Middlesex School in Concord, I think things would have gone very differently for me. I hope well, but I can't imagine they would have gone as well.
No counterfactual to that, of course, but an interesting, a very interesting story. So this book came out of some research you did on Beatlemania, if I recall the genesis story correctly. Research that was picked up by as diverse a set of outlets as Scientific American and The Guardian and the New York Times. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that genesis story. And clearly, you are a big, not only a cultural maven with, again, not unlike your academic and writing pursuits, with a broad appetite for culture, but also a big music fan. So talk a bit about your connection to the Beatles and why this was a topic that was worthy, at least initially, to do some research on.
It's a little surreal. So in 2021, as soon as President Biden was elected, I went in the administration very close to the first day in the Department of Homeland Security, where I accepted a position as a senior counselor on regulations and worked in the government. After about a year, I shifted to becoming what's called a special government employee, which I still am, which means you work not full time, but you can do a lot of the same things you would do if you were full time. As a special government employee, the ethical constraints on someone who works in the administration are fewer. So you can have some time in which you teach, you can have some time in which you write. There are constraints in talking about politics or government, but if you write about music and the Beatles and fame, you're fine. So I thought, what am I going to do now that I have freedom? And I saw there's a new journal called the Journal of Beatles Studies. And I thought that's sufficiently absurd. The idea of my writing for them, the idea of a Journal of Beatles Studies seems to me fantastic. The idea of my writing for them, law professor writing for them, is absurd. But I wrote the editor and she said, sure, give us a proposal. And I wrote a proposal to compare the Beatles' Norwegian Wood to Bob Dylan's Fourth Time Around, which seemed to me an act of one-upsmanship, an homage, and basically telling John Lennon, anything you can do, I can do better. And I thought that would be an interesting comparison. I started to write it and it was terrible. I don't know enough about music. I have the paragraph somewhere on this very laptop, but it was awful. And I thought, I can't write about this, but I really want to write for the Journal of Beatles Studies. So I wrote something about Beatlemania and the near failure of the Beatles and the sources of their unbelievable success. And the tale is actually beyond belief how it happened and how it almost didn't happen. And that piece on Beatlemania, I posted before sending it out for peer review. I posted it on the Social Science Research Network, which is not a site visited by the entire world, though I love it dearly. And I found, as you say, that it got picked up by outlets in a way that, in a very tiny way, was replicating what the paper was about, which is the serendipity of, let's say, not quite fame, but knownness. And then my little essay on the Beatlemania was in the UK and in the United States a little bit of a thing. And then people said, "Will you do a book on this?" And if people ask me to write a book on something, maybe it's about chargers for cell phones or about curtains. These are things I'm looking at in my room right now. I'll say, okay, I'll write a book about curtains. And if they say write a book about Beatlemania and the Wellsprings of Fame, that's better than writing a book about curtains.
I find it so funny that just the notion of you writing for this journal was enough to get you to do so. It seems like, kind of just the amusement of it, the fact that it was fun for you to understand the dissonance between the concept was enough to propel you to do something about it. Is that amusement and fun, is that often a kind of motivator for you like that?
Completely. I knew the Journal of Beatles Studies has very strong editors. It's from the University of Liverpool. I knew it was going to be good. I didn't know
Wow.
whether I was going to be able to write something that was suitable. The idea of my writing for the Journal of Beatles Studies, there's something incongruous about that. And having spent a pretty grueling year of being a bureaucrat and thinking a lot about the Administrative Procedure Act and the Supreme Court decisions in Fox Television and State Farm, giving you a sense of the technicalities. I thought to go from that to writing for the Journal of Beatles Studies, that just seemed too fun. And fun is often, I get this a little bit from Dick Thaler, my co-author, who only does things if they're fun. And when we did our book Nudge, both the first time and the second edition, just a couple of years ago, we had a rule, which is we wouldn't include a chapter unless we both found it fun. And that's Thaler's kind of approach to academic life. Now, of course, it's often arduous. You're compiling footnotes, you're struggling with ideas, but if you're smiling or laughing, then you probably should keep at it.
One thing that I've heard you talk about in comparing Thaler with Kahneman is you said that Kahneman, even well into his 80s, was working as though he was, a struggling new academic, kind of long hours, very self-critical. Whereas you talk about, you described Thaler as being fundamentally lazy. And the advantage of being lazy is, as you point out, that it takes a lot for him, something really great for him to get up off the figurative sofa and get to work. But as a result, he only focuses on those things that are excellent. Where would you put yourself in the continuum? If those are two poles of a sort of very successful and bright and admirable academics, where would you put yourself in the between those?
I'd say I'm a completely different creature from either. Thaler is one of my very best friends. Kahneman was one of my best friends. I wish I could say is. Thaler is lazy and full of fun. I have fun, but I'm not quite as focused on it as Dick is. And I confess I'm not lazy. So for me to spend a full day working, to get up at 7 in the morning and work really hard from 7 to 9, I like that. And Dick likes golf. I like squash. I do sports also. I don't only work, but for me, working on a Saturday or Sunday is completely great. I do share with Dick a sense of enjoyment or delight in work, but I have a real appetite for it. When I was in high school, people said that I was like the character Boxer in Orwell's Animal Farm, in the sense that when anything went wrong, Boxer would say, I will work harder. That's kind of how I am. If something's going badly, I say, I'll work harder. And I don't say it with a grimace. I'll say, okay, I'll work harder. So I'm not at all like Dick. Danny was delighted by new ideas and their destruction and improvement. Completely delighted by that. And I share that with him. Danny was obsessive about getting things right and was a real worrier. And I learned, and he continues to inspire me, that his rigor and intense care with his sentences and integrity, which was not like was kind of like a burden to him, but it was also like a badge of honor to him. So he wouldn't publish something unless and until he got it right. And to wait, years and years, that's completely fine. To do something and find it fails and not publish it at all, that's completely fine. I'm a much happier warrior, I'd say, than Danny. And while I hope, I try really hard to get it right, sometimes I'll look at a manuscript and I'll think, this is not good enough, really, but I can't make it better, and roll the presses. And Danny would never think that.
Interesting. Yeah, his characteristics are so I found at least really highlighted well in Michael Lewis's Undoing Project, his book that features Kahneman and Tversky. Speaking of Daniel Kahneman, you highlighted a concept that I believe he brought to life for you, which is sampling on the dependent variable. And you talk about multiple instances of this, the whole notion that, if you find 50 or 100 successful leaders and all of them had tough childhoods, that's the explanation as to why they became successful, or that, so there are famous cases of college dropouts starting world-beating companies, and therefore that's the missing ingredient for people, that you're a sucker to go for the full 4 years if in fact that's your ambition. But you've noted that intuition misleads us in many cases, but in this one very specifically. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. I think it was an important, I found at least, a very clarifying point, which in some ways actually sets up, you mentioned it early enough in how to become famous, that there's kind of a recognition, wait a second, I guess we're not going to get to how one becomes famous because of this conundrum that you're setting up. Can you talk a little bit about that insight, please?
Thank you for that. So I had an astounding student maybe 8 or 9 years ago who said she wanted to do a project on fame and success. And what she wanted to do was contact 70 or 80 really famous or successful people, ask them a battery of questions, and figure out what they had in common. And she was sufficiently energetic and sufficiently sharp that I had no question she would be able to do this project, that she'd get people to take her calls. She just was the first person who could make that work. But I had a thought that there was something wrong with this project, that even if everything went the way she thought, she wouldn't have discovered what was right or anything very useful. And I called up Danny and said, is there something wrong with this project? And he said, of course, this is a terrible project. Don't advise her. Don't tell her not to do it. And I said, can you clarify? And he said, she's sampling on the dependent variable, meaning she was going to find some characteristic that unified, let's say, a large sample of people. Maybe they had, as you say, unhappy childhoods. Maybe they're really determined. Maybe they're resilient. Maybe they're impatient. And they all had that, let's just say. But then there are probably 700,000, maybe 700 million people who didn't do well, who had unhappy childhoods, or who were impatient, or who were determined, or who had some other characteristic they all shared. So this was profoundly illuminating for me. It clarified my uneasiness about her project. And you can find in just about any bookstore a bunch of bestsellers that do exactly what she did. They find in business or in some domain 10 to 50 to 300 people who share some characteristic and claim that's the clue or the secret to their success. In fact, it's tempting to say that sampling on the dependent variable is a surefire way to have a bestseller, but that would itself be sampling on the dependent variable. So let's not do that.
Very meta there. I like that. Early in the book, you tell the story of Connie Converse, who became famous posthumously only. You also allude to Robert Johnson, who produced only 27 songs and died in obscurity as well. I wonder, what lessons do you draw from their experiences? These artists that in their own time didn't achieve the success they would have wanted, but only after the fact were appreciated for the positive contribution they actually had created.
I'll tell you something very cool, which is last night I had dinner with two quite successful, I'm in LA, so I had dinner with two quite successful musicians who happen to be friends. And I mentioned Connie Converse, fully expecting that they would want the story. And they both nodded and said, of course, they know who she is. And that was super interesting to me, that she has penetrated to that extent. So Connie Converse was a little bit before Bob Dylan folk singer who wrote her own folk songs. She did it before Dylan did. She was really good. She tried. She didn't make it. She didn't. She didn't get anywhere. She joked, "I have dozens of fans all over the world," which is shows something about her sensibility. She was on national television once. There's no record of her of the recording. There are photographs, and it didn't vault her anywhere. We don't know why exactly. After about 10 years of trying, she gave up and moved from New York to Michigan, where she became an editor of a political science journal. She was really good at that. And then in her 50s, she disappeared. It's a big mystery what happened. Probably she killed herself. That's probably what happened. This would have been an unknown story, except to her friends and family, except that a short snippet of Connie Converse was played on the radio in New York decades after her death. And there was a teenager who was at New York University who thought, who is this? She's phenomenal. And he was haunted by her and kept playing little bits of her to his friends. And then he became, how likely is this? He became an employee at a recording studio and played some Connie Converse to a friend of his who said, we should do a record of Connie Converse. And they tracked down her brother and they tracked down the person who had some of the tapes, and she became a Spotify kind of icon. And there are many millions of downloads on Spotify. There's a big book about her by Howard Fishman. It's phenomenal. She might be well on her way to becoming like Robert Johnson. That is a very big figure in music. Now, the lesson of this is there are approximately a zillion people around us right now who are really good at something and doing that thing that they're really good at, and they'll never make it unless they get something, a stroke of luck, let's call it, or a champion or a network. And that there are maybe 30 zillion people in the last 100 years who are like that, who actually did produce something and we don't know about it. And this is kind of tragic, but it's also inspiring and kind of thrilling. So if you walk down the street and see people who are struggling or doing something maybe that doesn't delight them, the chance that they could have been, but for the grace of God, something amazing, that's real. And that I think kind of inculcates a sense of, it should, of humility on the part of those who've done really well. And also a sense of no one's better than I am on the part of people who haven't done so well.
Yeah, very interesting. And you began to allude to some of the four mechanisms that help explain fame and success. Those are, as you define them, informational cascades, reputation cascades, group polarization, and network effects. I wonder if you could take just a brief moment and define each of the four of those, and then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question to help personify each, if you don't mind.
Okay, let's talk about group polarization. If you get a group of people together who tend to think that Taylor Swift is good, after they talk with one another, they're probably going to think, rightly as it happens, that Taylor Swift is phenomenal. So a group of people engaging in interactions with one another end up typically thinking a more extreme version of what they thought before they started to talk. They become unified, confident, and extreme. This is true with respect to political views, like whether climate change is terrible or a hoax, but it's, for present purposes, true for Stephen King and Charles Dickens and Bob Dylan and, let's say, Beyonce. People get charged up. That's group polarization. Network effects mean that sometimes people engage in something, some activity, not because they particularly like the activity, but because the network is something from which they benefit. Maybe they love being part of a network, maybe it gives them some additional something in life. So Stan Lee, the Marvel Comics guy, was acutely aware of this and kind of created Marvel Comics networks. They had names, they were societies. And for people who are fans of, I was on a Taylor Swift podcast, by the way, very recently, and they were very clear that the Taylor Swift network is very cool for people. To be part of that network is what they like. And Taylor Swift herself is very alert to that, as Stan Lee was with respect to Marvel Comics. So networks, Star Wars really benefited from network effects. A lot of people wanted to be part of the network of people who saw and talked about and breathed and lived Star Wars. An informational cascade is when information about the quality of something spreads from one person to another person to another person to another person, such that the people in the queue end up learning from the informational signal given by the enthusiasm of those who preceded them. And they end up adding to the volume of a signal which they are themselves motivated by. So if you think of, let's take a movie that's done really well, let's take an old one, Dr. Zhivago, there was informational cascading on the part of moviegoers saying, have you heard about Dr. Zhivago? Have you seen it yet? And then once the number of people who were enthusiastic about Dr. Zhivago grew to a certain level, then everything could go whoosh. And this can lead to amazing success on the part of a movie, an author, an actor, whatever. I mean, is Warren Beatty that much more amazing than 50 other people who were his contemporary who never made it in the way he did? Sorry, Mr. Beatty, you are amazing, but probably not. There's an informational cascade. You can see this, by the way, among high school students. I saw it myself, where if high school students get a reputation among teachers as good or as not good, then they could get the benefit of the doubt in grading. And that sure happened to me. I got a reputation as a good student, and I got some A's that I probably didn't deserve because the teachers thought everyone else is giving them A's. I probably should too. Okay, reputational cascade is when people join in enthusiasm for something, not because they think the thing's really good necessarily, but because they want to get the reputational benefits of knowing about or liking the thing, or not get the reputational costs of not liking or not knowing about the thing. So let's think about authoritarian governments. They try to induce reputational cascades. So if you say the leader is really bad, you know that you're going to be in trouble, not only with your government, but also with peers who will be a little scared of you, meaning you're rotten and your stench might spill over to them. The East German government used reputational cascades pretty effectively. That's what the Stasi did. Authoritarian governments of all kinds do that. And of course, if there's something that's taking off or someone that's taking off, Ayn Rand, the kind of right of center kind of individualist writer, she benefited in her time from a reputational cascade among a number of young people. And she continues to benefit every year from a reputational cascade. So she has blips of extreme popularity.
You were caught up in that as a youngster yourself, I've read.
For about 3 weeks. I was
Okay.
an Ayn cult member. Only 3 weeks.
Oh, interesting. I wanted to also add, well, actually, maybe this is, as we've mentioned her already several times, and you've teased out the Easter egg, so to say. Why doesn't Taylor Swift get a full chapter as frequently as she's mentioned across this conversation, but in the book itself?
Well, I'm a big fan of Taylor Swift, I should say, and I did research on her, and I got one of my research assistants to do research on her. So for Harvard Law student research assistant to spend some time researching Taylor Swift, I'm not sure whether my research assistant thought this is great or instead thought I'm going to Harvard Law School and this is what I'm researching on. The Taylor Swift tale is I think, less well known in its details and less knowable in its details right now than similar tales for the Beatles and for Bob Dylan, who did make it into the book. So we know a few things about Taylor Swift. We know that she won a contest that really helped her a lot. We know she got some people who could help her in Nashville, got interested in her, who would maybe without them, she would have really struggled. We know her parents made a decision to move to Nashville. That's a pretty surprising decision. And do parents do that a lot? No, parents don't do that a lot. Let's go to Nashville, everybody. And so there are a bunch of things that clearly were in the nature of strokes of good fortune or surprising turns for Taylor. But I don't have the goods in terms of the narrative for life. And while you can say things about Bob Dylan and John Keats and the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five, even, they make more than a brief appearance in the book, not long, but more than brief, that are kind of stunning. I'll leave it to Ms. Swift herself or her biographer to tell the tale.
Interesting. As you were describing, especially the informational cascades and the reputational cascades, it struck me. I was reflecting on the fact that you've spent time at the University of Chicago, which is famous for debates among professors, and a university that has perhaps more than most universities intellectuals of the right as well as the left. Whereas you've also currently at your present university been at places that, at least by polling, there's a lot more of a agreement in terms of politics, and forgive me for using that as one of many ways in which one might identify diversity or lack thereof. And so I wonder if even if your own experiences, as you think about the informational cascades and reputational cascades, it strikes me you've been in very different environments where in some cases people feel a great liberty to speak up with contradictions. And push towards countervailing forces in terms of ideas, and others where that maybe might feel as though that's a little bit less safe to do. Any reflections upon about that, whether it's university settings or government settings?
Yeah, I remember when I came to the University of Chicago, I had gone to Harvard Law School and then I had clerked for Justice Marshall in the Supreme Court. At Chicago, everyone was nice, but they thought some things that I'd never heard before and I thought were, bizarre. Many of those things are now the law, by the way, like the view that it's very important in understanding the Constitution to attend to the original public meaning of the document. It's kind of the law now, at least a number of the Supreme Court justices are for it. I hadn't heard that. At least I hadn't heard it defended till I came to the University of Chicago. And there are people who thought the minimum wage was a really bad idea, that it was going to hurt workers. And I don't think I'd heard that either. Or if I'd heard it, it was more like spitting in your face than a sustained argument. And that Chicago they had as a sustained argument. The rent control, which I thought was probably a good idea. At Chicago, they thought that was self-evidently a terrible idea. And I learned from all this. And the fact that I saw it and was not so much, appalled as startled, that was good for me. I was startled to hear all this. And as you say, Chicago is a place where any idea really is welcome, so long as it can be defended. I mean, if you say Hitler was great, people won't like that very much. But there are a lot of things that you can say and there's no sense of political correctness. Harvard Law School, where my principal home is, and I also have an affiliation with the economics department at Harvard, they're similar in that way. So at the economics department and in the law school, there's a ton of intellectual variety, let's call it. So people who are right of center are plentiful at Harvard Law School, both in the student body and on the faculty. And there's no sense that you can't think anything in particular collectively. There is a law school I visited, and I'm not going to name it because I love it, where I do sense there's a left of center orthodoxy, which is a little like a machine of social influences. It's a little like group polarization, where to be centrist or right of center is kind of a bad, not just wrong, but bad, immoral, and that's not healthy for that institution.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing those perspectives. It strikes me, it seems like the possibility of becoming famous is more accessible, it would seem at least, with reality stars and social media being a means of developing influence relatively quickly, certainly relative to many decades ago. And I wonder, what do you think about the goal of becoming famous, which many people these days articulate as a very specific goal?
I think it's a ridiculous goal. So I recently read a book, a terrific book in draft by a very distinguished philosopher, who ponders the following question. Would you rather want many years from now your name to be known and your work to be unknown, or your work to be known and your name to be unknown? And the philosopher who wrote this book finds that a very hard question, and says that he has puzzled over it with other academics, and they find it hard. I think that's the easiest question in the world. If your name is known, then and your works aren't, what good does that do anyone? If your work is known and your name isn't, then at least what you worked on is contributing to people, and that's a great honor. And so fame as a goal seems to me very puzzling, like spectacularly puzzling. It might be that people think of fame as a proxy for things. So they think if they were famous, but also sad and unpopular and poor, that wouldn't be so good. But if they're famous, the chance that they're going to be popular and have friends and have the money they need and be happy is higher, and that's okay. But the idea of fame as such, I don't get that.
It makes a lot of sense the way you describe that. I wonder if we take a brief moment to talk about the Music Lab experiment, which also features prominently in a section of the book and also offers some explanations in terms of what becomes famous and what does not. Can you talk a bit about that and your experience with it?
This is the world, I think. The Music Lab is the world. The Music Lab is everywhere. So here's the Music Lab. There's a website where there are a large number of songs by a large number of bands, and people can visit and they can download the ones they like. Call that the control condition, where you just find out which songs are popular. Doesn't mean they're the best, but it does give you a sense of what people like. Then there are treatment conditions in which people are sorted randomly into groups, not in the same room, but kind of online. They can see something about the behavior of other people in their group. And we have a large number, thousands in each group. And in your group, let's say it's the same as the control group, you can download, but you see how popular the songs are in the sense of how many downloads they're getting. So let's describe some real songs in the Music Lab experiment. I Am Error, that's a fortunately named song. Trapped in an Orange Peel, that's a regrettably named song, but kind of memorable. And Gnaw, Gnaw. So let's say in the control, where people are just going to the website and downloading songs, Trapped in an Orange Peel is a big winner and Gnaw just isn't. You might predict that in the end, all of the groups will converge on the songs that are popular in the control, because those are the good songs. It might take a while, but eventually every group is going to look alike. That's not at all what happened. Basically, the very best songs in the control never completely tagged, and the very worst never went completely to the top. But other than that, anything could happen. So Gnaw could be a fantastic winner in one group if it got early downloads, and it could be a disaster in others if it didn't get a lot of early downloads. Trapped in an Orange Peel could do super well in one group and super poorly in another group. And this is a staggering result. It suggests that real people visiting a real website can make songs very popular or very not popular, depending on one thing, whether it gets early popularity. And that's suggestive, I think, in a circumstance where it shouldn't have worked. It's too pure a test. It shouldn't have worked. The real world isn't pure. It's got a lot of mess in it. There aren't just dozens of songs, there are infinite numbers of songs. So too for books. The suggestion is that if something gets the benefit of early downloads or the equivalent, it can vault to the top. And if it doesn't, it can collapse to the bottom. And intrinsic quality isn't sufficient to be a driver of success. We can think of, I'll give you just one example because it's familiar to me and more relevant than it should be. Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a runaway bestseller. It sold millions and millions of copies. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a retrospective of 30 years of psychological findings. It happens to be really good. Did the experts, the specialists whose job it is to predict book sales, think this would be a runaway bestseller? Absolutely not. And what happened was it's a little like a song that got the equivalent of early downloads. It got a big boost in the New York Times. There was some word of mouth that everyone's reading Thinking Fast and Slow. The publisher was very agile at telling everyone that everyone was reading Fast and Slow. And then we were off to the races. The world is like this in the sense that Taylor Swift and Beyonce, great as they are, they benefited from the equivalent of a lot of early downloads. Now, that doesn't mean that it was completely random. It also involved talent on their part and super marketing. But talent and super marketing aren't enough.
A lot of authors think of books like children. You can't, you shouldn't rank them. But you've noted that this is your favorite book. I wonder if you could explain why.
The best ranker of his own books is Charles Dickens, who wrote in one of his books a very moving preface saying that every parent has in his heart of hearts a favorite child, and every author does too. And he said, and his name is David Copperfield. That was Dickens on his own favorite book. This was of my books to date. I'm working on some others right now, but the most fun I've ever had. It was crazy fun. And I felt that the range of emotions and thoughts that the topic called up in the author was just so much more than in anything I've ever done. It's actually a really personal book. I talk a bit about my childhood, my parents, and I hope that's not just of interest to me. I hope it connects with experiences we all have with, eyes wide open and in awe of something, or fearful and lucky or unlucky. And the stories of Stan Lee, the Marvel Comics guy, and Bob Dylan, my favorite of them all. They're just so, I'm not sure what the right word is, cool and awesome. Those aren't good enough. They're too cliche. But the idea that a guy kind of 40, a failed would-be novelist who's writing almost by himself about superheroes and thinking, what is my life? And then he says, okay, I'm going to create the Fantastic Four.
As a last attempt, really, right?
Yeah, he was about to give up. And then if you think about it, the characters in the Fantastic Four, the male lead, Reed Richards has the one power he can elongate himself. And the woman lead, Sue Storm, has one power she can turn invisible. That's, my gosh, was he laughing about that? Or was his unconscious kind of sexist, but too exuberant to be offensive, really? Or maybe we should be offended, but it's funny. And the characters are funny. So the Thing, instead of saying up, up and away like Superman, says when he's ready to be a superhero, say it's clobbering time. Now, what 13-year-old isn't going to laugh at the idea that the superhero is saying it's clobbering time? So the story of Stan Lee, the idea that I would write the story of Stan Lee, that's itself extremely improbable, and it was really fun. And Bob Dylan runs away with the book because he's both in his lyrics and in his interviews, he's unique. And the idea that what he called a long piece of vomit, that is the lyrics to Like a Rolling Stone. The songs were hatred directed from some space that was some place that was real. How does it feel to be on your own with no direction home, like a complete unknown, like a Rolling Stone? That's angry stuff. But then as he sings it, it's a song of freedom and exhilaration. It's like a national anthem. And that's to write about that in Dylan that was really fun.
As somebody, as I mentioned earlier, who has such broad topics of interest and clearly broad passions as well, what are you reading, watching, listening to now that has you excited?
Well, I'm reading right now a book. It's actually part of the things that are stabilizing my computer right now as I talk to you. It's a book called Didion and Babbitts, and it's by Lily Analick, and it's coming out. I'm lucky enough to have the galleys. It's coming out in a few months. Eve Babbitts, who appears in the book, my book, because of Lily Analick, who did a book called Hollywood's Eve, which is about this writer who was not very successful in her time, admired by some, who was also beautiful, who slept with a very large number of men, and it appears not a tiny number of women, who was also an immensely talented teller of stories, which were kind of invented. Maybe Joan Didion's rival, but not known. And the book is a riveting account of two people who span a large range of the human race. I'm really liking it.
Interesting suggestion. Thank you so much for mentioning it. Well, Cass Sunstein, thank you so much for taking a little time with me today. Congratulations on your new book, How to Become Famous. It really is a great read, and I'm honored you would take a little time with me today.
The honor and the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much.